Welcome to the Apple Insider Podcast. This is your host, Stephen Robles, and today we have a special interview episode with guest Justin Santamaria. He actually worked on the teams at Apple. That was over FaceTime and iMessage. We're going to talk about that. He also worked at Airbnb and now has co-founded a new company called Future that's really revolutionizing digital fitness. We'll get to that in a bit. Justin, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Stephen. Long time reader.
Oh, wonderful.
So it's cool to be on the podcast.
Wonderful. So you worked at Apple. How long did you work at Apple? And, I mentioned you worked on FaceTime and iMessage, but what was kind of your path as you were there at the company?
Yeah, great question. I joined the company in 2003, and I was there for 10 years, or right under 10 years. They asked, did I get my 10-year plaque? And I was like, no, I didn't get my 10-year plaque. I was like 9.5 right there. I got my 5-year.
Very good.
But yes, I started at Apple in 2003. My first project was iTunes for Windows, and I was there for the launch of that product.
Wow.
So that's to think 2003 you're launching iTunes for Windows, 2007 you're launching iPhone. You're like, wow, that was a jump.
Yes, 4 years to go from iTunes on Windows to iPhone. My goodness. So you worked on iMessage and FaceTime. FaceTime launched in 2010 with iOS 4, then iMessage in 2011, 1 year later, iOS 5. What was your responsibilities in relation to FaceTime and iMessage during that time?
So during that time, I was managing the communications applications group. So anything on the client or on the device, on the iPhone, that app or that app experience, I was responsible for delivering on. And as part of that, working with our backend and server teams to actually define what is this service and how are we going to do it. Apple, at least at the time, didn't have any product managers kind of setting requirements. So it was up to actual engineering managers to figure out, okay, if we're going to deliver this product, what features does it have and how do we make that work? And so part of the development teams for both of that, and then responsible for that app side for both of those projects.
Fascinating. So definitely want to get to iMessage in depth in a moment. But
sure.
FaceTime came out with the iPhone 4. It was actually my very first iPhone was the iPhone 4.
Oh, wow.
The first one with the front-facing camera, and FaceTime obviously was the big feature for that. I want to ask about Steve Jobs talking about FaceTime being open source at the announcement.
Right, yes.
So before that, a lot of times from the outside, we don't know how long Apple is working on a new feature or service or app. So you being on those teams, can you recall when FaceTime kind of began production or when you guys actually started developing it before the 2010 launch date?
I sure can, because at that point, we're doing our 4th version of iOS. And at that time, you're at a breakneck pace in terms of developing software. And so basically, the way Apple and especially iOS software, the schedule works is it's backed up against a hardware schedule.
Right.
Like there's new phones coming from China, factories getting set up, it needs software. And so therefore this is the date. And that date did not move.
And that's the headlining feature of the iPhone 4 was the front-facing camera and the Retina screen.
And that's right. And so for that, it was coming right off of 3. That just, the next week you're like, okay, the 4 is going to have a camera. And, as far as hardware development, that's a much longer process. But at the time, the team was so small, you couldn't develop the software for the phone 2 out at the same time you were trying to develop for the very next version. So we got started right after, I guess it was the 3GS launch, working on what would become FaceTime, knowing, hey, there's going to be a front-facing camera. Clearly, we're going to do, FaceTime, because what else do you do with a front-facing camera? It's funny to think that selfie wasn't a coined term, or that wouldn't,
right.
Be enough for a front-facing camera to have a camera that you could take a picture of yourself.
Right.
We needed more. It was very clear that this was not a feature that we could slip, because you're right. It was a marquee thing. It had to happen. There was no choice.
Right.
And so you just work back. You're like, okay, we've got, 11 months.
Wow.
Let's get started.
Right. And that's one of those features that is not announced at like the developers conference because it's directly related to the hardware of the phone. So Apple's not going to say, hey, we have FaceTime coming in our unreleased phone that we're not going to tell you about.
Right.
So you had a solid year from 3GS launch, or 11 months at least, until the iPhone 4 was announced. And I still remember that keynote, Steve Jobs talking about FaceTime being a big deal.
Oh my goodness.
One of the most hilarious lines was Steve Jobs saying that we're going to make this open source So you'll be able to get FaceTime on devices besides the iPhone. And now fast forward 12 years, and we've just now, with iOS 15, kind of have FaceTime if you send a link to an Android or Windows user, but we definitely do not have FaceTime apps for those platforms. So tell me, when that happened, did any of you guys have an idea that he was about to say it, and what was the reaction after it happened?
Steven, that's so funny because I do remember that that whole
Well, it was a fall iPhone launch.
It was the fall announcement. That's right.
Yeah.
That fall announcement was the most stressful experience of my entire life.
Oh my goodness.
If you recall, they had to tell everyone to turn off their hotspots.
Right. Yes, that was that one.
That was because we were going to do the FaceTime demo at the end, and the phones on the stage were using the Wi-Fi that it was using Wi-Fi.
And all the press were using.
And all the press was using Wi-Fi, so there's so much interference.
We actually had in-person events. Yeah.
Yeah, this is back in the day. Can you imagine that? People flew out and all got in a room to see something.
Right.
It's 2010, and hotspots are a thing. So at this point, press is filing live reports and live blogging and all these things, and so everyone has their own hotspots, and the Wi-Fi spectrum's just hosed there. And if you remember, he's demoing Retina with the New York Times, and the New York Times page doesn't load.
Right.
And I know what the end of the demo is. And I'm like, the New York Times can't load.
FaceTime's going to have a problem.
This demo's toast. Like, there's no way.
Right.
I remember I was in the second row of that thing, and we had been rehearsing for 5 days before in Moscone Center, going through it. And working with the person setting up Wi-Fi, and he's got a meter there, and it's got the green, yellow, red type thing,
right?
And it's white. It's a color that wasn't even there, showing reading. Interference. Yeah, and so they turn off the phones, and we're able to get a demo through. But I was like, oh man, this was not expected at all.
We figured out why my demo crashed. Because there are 570 Wi-Fi base stations operating in this room. So all you bloggers need to turn off your base stations, turn off your Wi-Fi. Every notebook, I'd like them to put them down on the floor. And all of you look around, I'd like you to police each other.
As far as the open slide, I remember, I think that got added very late in the game.
Right.
It was definitely an 11th hour. Oh, I know. So I knew it was coming, but I didn't know what it was, and I don't think anyone else did either.
We're going to take it all the way. We're going to the standards bodies starting tomorrow, and we're going to make FaceTime an open industry standard.
So after the event, and that was announced, I don't think Apple ever really mentioned it again. It just kind of quietly dissipated into the ether. What was the behind the scenes talk? Was there ever efforts to make it open source or release it to other platforms? Or was it just like, JK, we're not doing this actually?
It was a long time ago. I know there were efforts. It was actually handled by a different group, believe it or not. So I was not responsible for delivering that. And I'm not too sure where that had landed. It's one of those things where I think it's easy to say and hard to put into practice.
Oh, for sure.
But I can't speak for, I wasn't responsible for the actual open part of that project. But Was it a project? Yes, I think it was.
Very good. Well, then 1 year later, in 2011, iMessage launches with the iPhone 4S, Apple's messaging service to compete with, at that time, BlackBerry Messenger and other messaging services. What was your role specifically in the iMessage development? Was it the app side, service side, or both?
It was both. I was responsible for the app side directly and for launching as a whole, and was working very closely to define that service side and what would it entail and how would it look, and working with our design team as well as our back-end team, our server team, as well as the app team that I was directly responsible for to develop iMessage off the heels of FaceTime.
We'll get to the modern conversation, or at least today's talk about iMessage and RCS and all that. But in that initial development stages, now we kind of talk about the colors and how the green bubbles almost have this averse emotion when people see the green as opposed to the blue. Do you have any recollection of what the color choice process was like? Was there any kind of testing of different colors? Do you know, were you responsible in any of those talks?
If you recall, the SMS
It was already green. The Messages app was just all
was
green.
Before. Yeah. Like Messages app, it was called the SMS app. It was green. It had a green icon. In fact, the Messages app today, if I'm not going crazy, still has a green icon.
Oh, it's still green.
There was never any pejorative green discussion, right? Like in fact, that was the default color. And if you recall, prior to iMessage, the send button was blue.
The bubbles were all green.
The bubbles were all green. And as a part of building the client-side platform, I think the big thing, it's funny because it reduces to blue bubbles and green bubbles, but I think the real innovation or the real Kickstarter of this is iMessage sits in the same app as SMS. And you as a user don't necessarily, I think the theory is the user shouldn't have to think about the technology behind sending a message. You open your app, I want to talk to my wife, or I want to talk to my friend, and it's not like, whoa, what should I choose? I just open this and I'll get the best experience I can for getting this message from point A to point B. And I think that kind of triggers this whole, okay, so how do I know I'm getting the best experience? And really, you could argue a user doesn't even necessarily need to know that, but a developer does. Right. If you're building and testing the app, you need to know, did that send as an iMessage or did that send as a text message, or what should I expect? Should I expect a delivery receipt here? Should I expect a red receipt? And then that does end up carrying to the users. Like, how do you set the expectation that the thing you sent will be received in the way you're intending? And so that kind of carried through. And it was really more of an informational detail of you're going to get an enhanced experience because the bubble is blue, rather than the base level experience because the bubble is green. And what that did is it gave us a lot more ability to have these two technologies coexist in the same app.
That's what made it so powerful, was that the users really didn't change their procedures at all.
That's right.
The same app that they were using for SMS texts for the 3 to 4 years prior, now they use the same app in the same way, but they automatically get an upgraded experience if they're talking to another iPhone user, which, that integration, I think, made it such a powerful feature. Also, just a side note, I'm really glad to hear you say red receipts, because I hear people say read receipts, and I'm like, I don't know if that's right. So from the inside, can you tell us officially, did you guys call them red receipts?
I can't speak for that.
Okay.
I think, but I say red receipts, I guess. I wasn't even...
because I read the message.
It was subconscious.
It means I read the message.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if I want to dip my toe there, but I suppose I say red receipts since you caught it in my subconscious.
Very well. Well, I agree with it. That's what I say as well. Now, at the time when iMessage came out in 2011, and in the few years after, I guess you were there about another year and a half or 2 years after iMessage launched, were there any conversations at the time about iMessage being launched for other platforms like Android, whether it was with the development team or with VPs or even whoever else was up the chain? Was there any talk about that at the time?
I recall having this be an open question. Like, should this be on other platforms all the way from, should this be a federated system? Should we build an Apple Android iMessage app? It was definitely something, that's part of the conversation. I don't think any technology company like cuts off any sort of thinking. Now, privately you figure out what your message is, you go forward with it, but you try to figure out where this is going to go. And when I was there, it was very clear to me that we wanted to innovate on the iOS platform. The team still was very small, so there was also just kind of a we're not gonna build this right now, whether or not strategically it makes sense or not. I think iPhone and iMessage was still kind of in its infancy to be like, well, how much do we expand this? Because it's definitely, Apple traditionally has been, we sell hardware. Let's build software for hardware, and not, hey, let's build ecosystems for communication. And so that was kind of always the default mindset when I was there. And I think there's this interesting thing, and it's actually because of FaceTime that iMessage was a service that used your phone number as your identifier. You didn't pick a screen name, right? And it uses the same service, the registration service that FaceTime used. And so we got to piggyback off of that. And so there's also this question that kind of starts to come up, like, who owns the phone number, and how do you know that's giving you the right signal on what the phone number is? And I think that just that one question, you go, okay, this is like not just a quick port. We have to actually really understand how these things can work. Then priorities happen and you got to ship the next iPhone, and that would never be a, hey, engineers on the ground wrote this thing, let's ship it. It's like a very strategic question that needs to be answered by the powers that be.
Well, I also think, yes, it started with your phone number via carrier, and this will play into the RCS conversation also. But now when you have an iMessage attached to your iCloud account, it's also attached to your email address, like your iCloud email address. And for like my kids who use iMessage all the time, they don't have a phone yet, so they don't have a phone number. So nothing is attached to a carrier. Their iMessage experience is strictly relegated to their iCloud email address, and it's still the same product. They still message and have all the same features as iMessage elsewhere. And I think that's a major advantage that iMessage has in compared to something like RCS or even WhatsApp that really tries to make your messaging account attached to your phone number, which in the future could change. I think there's a higher likelihood that someone's phone number might change. Maybe they even move to a different country or just a different state here in America, as opposed to your iCloud email, which has the potential to be the same for your entire life. And I would prefer whatever identity the people closest to me message me with is that identity instead of a phone number that is beholden to a carrier that I may lose one day if I go to a different carrier. For that, my next question to you then is now to the modern conversation of RCS versus iMessage. There's pressure on Apple to either adopt RCS into the Messages app or open up iMessage to other platforms. I think the latter is much less likely. How do you feel now, kind of being not working for Apple for a number of years, but you're still an entrepreneur, still in the technology space? Well, what are your feelings on that closed ecosystem versus RCS, and what do you think Apple should do here?
Yeah, great question, Stephen. And it's interesting, just to piggyback off that before I go into this, which is, the whole iCloud email as an addressable unit. That was very early in our system. And that was really to support iPod Touch back in the day and iPad.
Right.
Because those didn't necessarily have cellular service or phone numbers for that matter. And so we wanted this to support, the Apple ecosystem. And it's interesting how that's carried over into, other just basic use cases and is still very applicable today. I had a conversation about RCS in like 2011 with phone carriers.
Oh, wow.
And so it's not like RCS is a new thing.
Right.
In any way. And it's something that is only now coming up, I think, because it's receiving adoption. I think, I think when you say pressure, I think there's, a very specific set of company that is doing that. And I think there's a bigger question here, and that is around ability to deliver. And when you create interoperability across even platforms or companies or networks or systems, you essentially put a stake in the ground and say, this is kind of the base experience. And you kind of agree to innovate in a way that will always support the base experience. And this is kind of something that RCS is an evolution. It comes from the same, place that SMS and MMS came from,
right,
which is, classic cellular technology. But the reason why iMessage was developed was because SMS and MMS were these very base level, basic experiences, because it needed to work for, every phone that supported this. And you end up having to kind of understand that there's a reason why when you send a message that's not over iMessage, it's a postage stamp. And why you basically can't send a video over MMS. That's not to say that you shouldn't interoperate. You could say, hey, SMS, how has that evolved? Has everything moved past that? And is there a new kind of base standard to support across platforms? I haven't looked at the RCS doc in years, so I couldn't say.
Well, and let me ask you this, because I have made the argument that Apple is not going to adopt a technology that does not work as people would expect it to yet. And if you look at RCS right now, Verizon is supporting RCS. They're calling it their advanced messaging features, but it does not work cross-carrier yet. Same with AT&T.
Right.
So if Apple even adopted RCS right now and said you can use RCS in the Messages app, it's built in, me as an AT&T user could actually not use advanced messaging features via RCS with a Verizon user because the carriers still don't support that interoperability. And I feel like Apple is not going to adopt something where customers are going to be like, why isn't messaging working with my Android friends as I thought it would? But when it's still on the carriers to get their act together. I mean, does that kind of jive with your history with Apple?
I mean, let me put it differently, because I think it's totally at the crux is, Apple and to some extent other technology companies are trying to solve problems for people. They're not trying to figure out how to adopt technology for the sake of adopting it, for the most part. I think when you're trying to solve a problem for users, you don't do this. Now, is that narrative violated occasionally? Of course. But at a base level, that's, I believe, at least when I was at Apple, success begat success in the sense that if you were successful with your users, they would buy your products and you could do more.
Yeah.
And here is a perfect example of when's the last time I had to worry about what carrier you were on and what carrier I was on? That's kind of a solved problem. Why would we reintroduce that when it comes to this stuff? Right? In fact, there's if you really need true ubiquity, you go use WhatsApp, because you have international friends and family, and that's a multi-platform thing. And no, that's not Apple. That's not iMessage. No. But do they have an app on every device in most countries? Yes. And you can go use that if that fits what your needs are. And so it goes back to, okay, what's the base level universal experience?
Right.
And in the sense, RCS is not the base level. And in fact, it's not even close to being the base level because SMS and MMS work effectively everywhere. And then what's on top of that, actually users do have choices, but also, like you said, why now do I need to worry about that? Why would I adopt that?
Right. Mainly just because Google's vice president is tweeting about it. That's really the only reason.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about Google is they've had Google Hangout, and they essentially abandoned it.
They had Allo, Google Hangout, Google Wave, Google Gchat.
Yeah, and pick your thing. And I think there was, they have their reasons, right? The proposed solution doesn't even jibe with the complaint in today's world. And maybe if that changed, then there could be something there. But as far as right now, I don't see that happening.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about your company future, but just real quick before we get to that, you were working at Apple when Steve Jobs passed in 2011. I still remember that Wednesday evening when I saw the news, and it was sad, even for someone who had never worked for Apple or had any communication with Steve Jobs. It was still emotional for me. What was it like for you and internally during that time and during that transition?
There are things in your career that you never forget, and that's certainly one of those days. I was sitting in my office in IL2, Infinite Loop campus. The new campus obviously was still it was in the planning stages, and I come out of my office, and it's funny because I think it's I load CNN on my computer, and I see the headline, and it's Steve died, and he had been sick, and he had resigned, and you knew these things, but you just didn't know. And I remember coming out and seeing my team, and it was very, very somber.
Yeah,
you do what's comfortable, right? And so we sat around and talked, and we end up going to BJ's, which is the restaurant and bar that's right next to Apple campus. And we kind of sat and talked and told stories, our Steve demo stories, and our Steve kind of just, you reminisce and you tell stories, and it's sad. And no one on my team was like, hey, I was just so buddy with Steve or anything like that.
Yeah.
But we all had interacted with him at some level or another. And in a deeper way, he was the guiding force of the company at that time. And you trusted decision-making because you knew he was at the helm. And many of us, myself included, joined the company because we all saw something very special in the leader of that company, and that leader had left us. I remember at the time, my girlfriend, now wife at the time, drove home. We lived in San Francisco and worked in Cupertino. I just remember getting about halfway home and just losing it, just bawling for a guy who probably didn't know my name. I mean, we worked together about, on stuff, but he did that with hundreds of people.
Sure.
And just feeling a real loss. And I think over the past years, having him be part of my story about products that I built and worked on and demos that I gave to him and feedback I got from him. I knew it was special then, but only as time passed have I realized like how truly unique that was. And it was something that, I'm just so thankful to have had direct exposure to the guy.
So did you actually have some situation where you actually pitched something to him during your tenure at Apple? Or
all the time, because I was responsible for FaceTime and iMessage and the client experience. I was always, every Monday afternoon, during development, you're on a cycle where you're constantly giving demos, and especially for like FaceTime, someone needs to be on the other side of that call. And I would say, a chunk of that time I was on the other side of that call. So yeah, definitely.
There's tons of stories, both in his biographies and in the creative selection book, of kind of his notorious quick decision making, or just very much like this or this. What do you think? Giving it to the developer or whoever is working and just going with it. Did you ever have that kind of experience where it was just a very like quick, like, yep, that's the one, or
absolutely,
nope, not that?
Oh, absolutely, all the time. And in fact, it was such a known style of Steve's that I would often tell my team, hey, if you don't like the one he picked, it's because you gave him that option. Like, don't give him bad options. Like, that's our, because it's like, oh, Steve decides everything. It's like, no, but Steve decides from what we show him.
Right.
And so if we show him two crappy things or three crappy things and he picks a crappy thing, well, whose fault's that?
Wow,
So, and then oftentimes he would push harder. I picked 0 of the 3. And that was always the most frustrating. Where you're like, wow, I really thought we were onto something here and we were super off track. The other thing I would say about Steve is he wasn't afraid to change his mind. And I think that's something that, that's a leadership quality that I try to emulate even more now, which is like when you have new data or you've thought about it and you've changed your mind, just express that and don't make excuses for that. If it's going to be better for the product, then fine. Better to know now than later.
Yeah.
As an engineer and as a manager, like that wasn't always as appreciated in the moment. But I think looking back, it was something that was pretty interesting to see that he could pick A one day, B the next day, and then be back on A the day after. But oftentimes it's like that ability to really kind of ruminate in what you might be able to do and the possibility that you end up on the right answer.
Right. That's fascinating. Well, after your time at Apple, you kind of went through Airbnb.
That's right.
Working on some of their platforms. And now you've co-founded a company called Future, really working in the digital fitness space, which I think is fascinating because Apple has just gotten into this space as well with Fitness Plus. But tell me a little bit about what Future is doing in the area of fitness.
I'm so excited to talk about Future because it's not an obvious next step for me on the face of things. But Future is really about connecting people with other people and helping them achieve their goals. It's this communication piece that I worked on in Apple and saying, if you had, you use FaceTime and iMessage to talk to your friends and family, but these days, if you can have someone in your life who is helping you with things that you need help with, and fitness is our first kind of subject matter, and you have an expert on the other side who's there to plug into your life, that's a very powerful thing. What we do is we connect people with fitness professionals, personal trainers, and performance coaches via our messaging service, actually.
Which you know something about building a messaging service.
Yes, which I know something about building about. And really establish a really strong personal connection and relationship and deliver on giving you highly customized plans and really try and meet you where you're at on your fitness journey or your health journey, adjust for that. And one of the things we noticed, especially with Apple Watch, there's like 100 million Apple Watches out there that all are giving great data about our health and about, our steps, our activity and these things. And what all that data has done is it's forced us to kind of marshal ourselves and develop an understanding of what's good and what's bad. And what we do is we take that and with our service, you get a real coach who's an expert who knows about this stuff and takes watch data, your workout data, and like builds a plan for you and around you. And it is just a very highly customized workout and fitness experience. And it's something that we just believe that at the end of the day, people move people and the technology can help with that. And so we're putting the coach at the center of this experience for our members. And so it's this health meets communication story here.
That's awesome because, it's interesting, especially since the pandemic, we've seen other areas, other industries move to this online and virtual connection point. I think about BetterHelp, which has sponsored this podcast a while ago. But, that really became elevated once it was like everyone has to stay home, but we still need mental health help.
That's right.
And so, services like that coming out. First of all, the app is beautifully designed. I'm looking at it right now. It's great ratings. It's like 4.9 stars. What exactly, once you get matched with a coach, is it just messaging? Is there any kind of video component? And, is there any kind of like FaceTime, for lack of a better word,
yes,
communication with your coach?
Great question, Steve. After you match with your coach, you actually get on a FaceTime call with them. We actually use FaceTime.
Very good.
And they get to know you, and you get to see, this is a real human. This is a real expert. This is a person who's going to know my name and understand me better and understand whether it's like, hey, I already work out at the gym 4 days a week and I've been doing the same routine and I need to unlock kind of the next stage of my fitness, or, hey, I'm just getting off the couch. I find my life to be super chaotic. I've got kids, I've got a family, I've got all this stuff, and I have a hard time finding time for this. And I know it's good for me. This isn't my natural hobby. Our coaches work around that. And they, for the first time, we're not saying, hey, here's some content, do it. And if you don't, it's your problem. We say, let's understand your situation and figure out how to unlock success with you. And what we provide is a workout experience. And so we have exercises and all that pre-recorded, so you can look at video on your iPhone. And we actually have an Apple Watch app. You can track everything and see what's coming up next and all this stuff. So there's this whole workout experience. But also, if you like to run or you do yoga, or let's say you even go to classes now that things are opening up, we're here for the entire experience. We're your hub for all your fitness and health needs. So we'll just add that in, and it's trying to figure out what's going to get you and keep you successful, and have you, if you could have a person for this journey, what would you want that person to do, is kind of what you could ask yourself. And it turns out that this is something that we see great success in, as you see with the reviews, and we have a very high success rate because we're not just kind of automating this. We're realizing that there's a real connection that gets developed, a real relationship. And now that I think what the pandemic has shown us is you don't need to just rely on just who are the people down the street that you can go in and make an appointment with, or who's being offered at your gym, but you can get really, really good expertise through digital means. And so our coaches are all over the country serving our members who are all over the country virtually. And that's something that I think isn't just a trend for fitness, but a trend for a lot of services moving into the future. And what we've done is we've really built a service around that relationship and that connection and that understanding that fitness is a highly personalized experience. And there's nothing more personal than having someone who's helping direct that with you.
And I love that initial kind of setup in the app process. It really asks you a lot of questions on what kind of coach you want, even up to the slider where you can say, I want a coach that's super intense or not intense at all. It gives me a little bit of peace of mind to know, like, this is the temperament of the person that's going to be coaching me over the next however long, hopefully a long time. But how much contact do the coaches and people using the app typically have? I mean, is this daily, multiple times a day? And what do those conversations typically look like?
That's a great question, Stephen. We built Future to be more than just about, let's just talk about your workouts, your reps, your sets, let's go. This is about much more than that. And so on average, our coaches are having conversations every day with their members. And some, if you don't want that level of engagement, you don't have to, but they exchange on average, 4 messages a day with clients back and forth, 1,500 messages a year. And that's, when you think about it, when you see your doctor, I don't see a doctor regularly, I should.
Right. But
you see your doctor twice a year, maybe. And so to have someone in your life who's in it, who's there. And those messages, they start out talking about your workouts and your, and how they're going and what your goals are and these sorts of things, or even trying to figure out what your goals should be. Maybe you come and you're like, I know I need to do this, but I haven't had any time for this. I don't think about this. Your coach is there to help you think about that. They're your advocate. what we see is that people start to talk about much more than their fitness. They talk about, their stress or how they're sleeping or how they're eating. And your coach can take that into consideration and really try to build a plan and give you advice that really puts you at the center of this. But you're not just trying to figure it out on your own. You really do have a thought partner in how to kind of live a healthier life. And it's really pointing at that journey, that it's not about just what the next goal is, but like, how do you just make decisions every day, and how do you have someone there helping you do that along the way?
Yeah, and I also love how much you integrate the Apple Watch. You even have an option to borrow an Apple Watch for the time while you're using the service.
That's right.
And it's incredible. And my wife actually saw a cardiologist the other day, and they said, hey, if you ever feel a certain way, take the ECG on your Apple Watch and send it to me. That data is great, and we find it reliable. And just that ability to have so much data about your health that's being tracked all the time that you can share with someone to then guide you in what to do next. How does that work with your coaches? What kind of data do they look for from your clients' Apple Watches, and then what do they do with that?
That's a great question, Stephen. And it's the closing of the loop of this type of data and giving it to an expert to make it actionable. An example I like to say is, if you get your 5,000 steps a day, so now what? Like, should I do 6,000? Does that materially change anything about me? I don't know. Well, there's people who actually have degrees in this stuff that know exactly, what that means and what you should do with that. And so for our coaches, looking at your heart rate and how that does during workouts and how it changes based off the exercises, looking at things like your runs and your pacing, and all these sorts of things are helpful to the coach in understanding that. And we plan to integrate sleep in all these things. So if you get a bad night's sleep, your coach can say, you know what, you're supposed to do a hard workout today. I'm going to dial that back. We're going to do some stretching. You're going to do some, breathing exercises, and we'll get back into it tomorrow.
Wow.
Like, that's the level of expertise and customization we offer.
That's so good because, my wife does a video series of workouts on our Apple TV. And, she tries to follow the 100 days, and she likes to go in order and, not miss a day. But there are some times where she didn't have a good night's rest, or it's just a really long day the day before. And she sees that there's a 45-minute high intensity workout on the schedule for that day. And then, it's that real struggle of do I push myself to do this, and then might I just take myself out for the rest of the day? Or do I do something different and feel like I'm messed up? I feel like I missed a day. And to have someone like a coach to say, I see that you didn't sleep well, you can take it easy today, and that's actually best for your health. Just having that little bit of peace of mind, I think, would be a huge deal for some people.
And Stephen, that's exactly it. Is we provide people the infrastructure they need to succeed. So many people hit that point where they're like, oh, I'm off track, or oh, I missed that one, or oh, I don't feel it today, and then they don't come back. And that's not because that person is lazy, and it's not because that person isn't motivated, and it's not any of that. It's just, and I put myself in that bucket, we need support.
Yeah.
And we need the okay, so what are the implications of that? Should I go back and do that workout? Should I do a light version of that workout? Does it count? Does it not?
Right.
To have someone's like, hey, that part's on me. You just tell me when you can show up and what you can give, and we'll figure out the rest.
Yeah.
That's like a totally different way about feeling and thinking about fitness. Traditionally, we've thought about it in terms of, here's the plan. If you follow it, you're good. And if you're not, that's kind of on you. Future takes just a different approach. It's very much like, let's figure out how to make this work. And if that's what you have today, that's what you have. And if it's not in the cards today, let's figure out how to make it work for tomorrow. And to give that space of understanding that we're human. Things are happening all the time. Your kid gets sick, you have to work late, or you slept like garbage the night before. And it's recognizing the humanity of life and putting that into service and saying, you don't need to figure this out all by yourself. That gets to the heart of why Future is so successful.
Very cool. So if someone wants to try Future, sign up for the service and give it a shot, where can they go to find it?
They can go to tryfuture.com.
Tryfuture.com. That's a good URL. Very cool.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and it is, we really try to develop a user experience that is not about the technology. It's not about the Apple Watch. It's really about getting you signed up, getting you going, getting you on your way. And the interesting part about the company is all of the complicated aspects are behind the scenes. And that's something that I think is directly from my experiences at Apple that we built it that way.
Yeah. And I have to say again, now I'm looking at the website. I was on the app before. you guys have beautiful design everywhere. And I don't know, I'm sure you're like this, but when I see something that's kind of not designed well, I'm averse to it. I don't want to use it. And you guys kill it. And I imagine that's part of your background. How much do you have in as far as overseeing like design work? Are you kind of deep into that? You really get involved with that, or do you have someone that really handles that well?
I'm responsible for design.
Yeah.
I'm not the designer. That's not my trade.
Sure.
Definitely I hire our designers, and they report to me.
You directly. I get it.
But that's the thing is like Future is about caring about the details and about getting the things right, because what we are doing is we're trying to be an advocate in your life. And so those details matter. And that's also why I think the, natural progression from Apple to something like this in a space that I think is often really very much about a certain type of attitude, to bring this considered approach is something I'm just ecstatic to be working on.
Very cool. We'll put links to the service and the app in the show notes if listeners want to click that. This has been a pleasure, Justin. Before we go, if you would oblige, I would love to know if you have one Steve Jobs story that really just stands out, that you remember either an interaction or a feature thing or something that that really just sticks in your mind. It was kind of that, I don't know, just one of those interactions with Steve Jobs.
I can do that. It's not an exclusive interaction. I've told the story before, but I think it's definitely one worth telling because this is a very personal interaction. It was a Friday afternoon, and I'm sitting in my office. And at this point, I'm a manager. I'm not developing code. I'm like, I'm a professional meeting guy. Right. And, I'm a meta worker, I like to say. And my VP and our program manager, Kim, our VP, Henri, come into my office and go, Steve wants to see FaceTime. Well, it wasn't called FaceTime at the time, but that's what I'll say. And I go, sure, great. Because it's Friday and demos are Monday afternoon, like should be fine, no problem. We'll get something ready. Ruins our weekend, but it is what it is.
Sure.
And they're like, no. He wants to see it today. And, it's like 10:30. I was like, okay, well, I'll get it set up over lunch, 1 o'clock work. And he's like, no. He's walking over from aisle 1 right now. I was like, what?
Dread. A feeling of dread.
He's walking over right now. And I mean, that's like 4 minutes notice, right? And I'm like, oh, no. Oh, no. And so I go to an engineer's office. His name's Jeremy. And Jeremy, do you have 2 phones at work? I think these do. They don't really connect. But like if you can get them like connecting, well, what was happening and just inside baseball, like the phone wouldn't wake from sleep. This is like early in development. This is like nothing ever works when you're in development. And so like if the push got sent, but the phone wouldn't wake up for the push, so you couldn't connect the FaceTime call. And so he's like, yeah, they don't wake up. So like you've got to like manually get the call to work. And you're like, okay, I can do that. So I literally have these 2 phones, and I mean. If you can imagine, like when you give a demo to Steve, or it's just the CEO of a large multinational corporation, you have the nicest devices. They're fully charged.
Right,
They've been spit shined, and here I have these like 2 like grubby fingerprints all over the thing. I mean, I'm just like, this.
You didn't have the Apple polishing cloth at that time.
Yeah, and that was probably deep in development. It took years.
10 years ago.
Yeah, and so I'm like, it's like I'm rubbing this thing against my shirt to try to get some of the. I was just like, this is such a disaster. And then sure enough, I see him turn the corner, and it's like, okay, it's showtime. And I hand him one of the phones, and I keep the other. And pleasantries are exchanged. And he goes, all right, well, go into your office so we can do this, because you can't be in the same room, obviously, to have a FaceTime call. So I'm literally go on the other side of my office door, close the door, and I hold the phone up, and I start doing what I do when I test the phone, which is you're testing audio, video sync, and all sorts of stuff. So, and this is something I've been doing for years because I worked on iChat before that, but we didn't get into that. And I stare at the camera, and I with my left hand, I start counting off 1, 2, 3, so that he can see the voice and see my hands, count it off, so you can see the synchronization, which is just a standard test we run. He's like, what are you doing? Like, talk to me like a normal human. And I was like, oh, geez.
You're doing the procedure, like that's.
Oh, sorry, Steve. Yeah, hey, how's it going? How's your week? And what's funny is Steve's holding the phone, and he's holding it at his chest and looking down.
The classic grandfather look for FaceTime.
And like half his face is in the bottom half of the screen type thing as well. and and he goes, I look abominable.
Oh, so good.
And it's early on in again, selfie is not a word yet, right? And so it's not like, oh, Steve, you're completely holding it wrong. That's not how the kids do it, because the kids didn't do it yet. You're like, exactly. Oh, I guess that's how you can hold it. That's one way to hold the phone.
Also, to say you're holding it wrong prior to the iPhone 4 antenna gate.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, geez, that was
You're holding it wrong.
Not my department. And from that, and then stuff happens, and after that there's other stuff that happens, but I just remember that, and it's a one-on-one with Steve, completely impromptu. But what came from that, and that's funny because that kind of sets the tone for this whole conversation, is at that point FaceTime was its own app. And he said, I should just be able to go from phone call to video call, or it should be one click. I shouldn't have to register a new service. There shouldn't It should just be tied to, if I know your phone number, I should be able to video call you. And that actual, I guess you could say directive, or that
a few second interaction,
comes there, and it completely changes what FaceTime becomes. And it actually is the thing that, eventually makes its way to iMessage, eventually allows you to overlay iMessage on top of SMS, and eventually gets you blue bubbles versus green.
Wow. Very cool. Well, that was a perfect bow for this conversation. Justin, thank you so much again. We'll put links to tryfuture.com. That'll be in the show notes. Also, Justin's Twitter and links to the Future app as well. Justin, thanks again for joining us on the Apple Insider Show.
Steven, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.